Okay, this is my second visit to Taiwan, and I've become increasingly impressed by its technological achievements and by the energy of the people. I really do. And when I look at Europe, and to some extent even Canada and the USA, Canada and the USA better get moving, and Europe has a lot of catching up to do because Europe is definitely falling behind. I don't know if you would agree with me on that. Would you?
I can fully agree. Yes, that was my observation too. The problem I think in Europe and for the West is people are aging. They have got a lot of money, so they've got also a lot of money to spend. But I felt a little bit awkward as well. I felt a little bit. I feel that as if we are being passed by not only Taiwan but by the whole region. So this is definitely a big challenge for Europe and for Canada, for the United States, not to speak of other less developed countries even in the West.
Yes. I also feel, and I've mentioned this in several columns, and this may seem preposterous initially, because communist China, mainland China, has a billion people, 1.3 billion people. Taiwan has only 23 million people. But my contention is that communist China should not be taken over Taiwan. Taiwan should be taken over communist China. And that's because I fully believe that communist China, the system, is basically falling apart despite some meddling and tinkering on economic freedom. But the standard of living there is extremely low on the mainland. The basic income, I believe, in Taiwan is $12,000 per person. On the mainland, it's $500 per person. There is massive poverty in communist China, large-scale unemployment that's never reported, and the pollution is intense. You look at Taiwan, there's really not very much poverty. I'll admit the standard of living for many people isn't what it is in Canada or the USA or Europe or Belgium. Belgium being part of Europe, of course. But people are advancing quickly, and the pollution is very slight here. And I just feel that if you would impose the Taiwanese system on communist China, giving communist China democracy and economic freedom, communist China's standard of living would rise much more quickly than it can now. Because in my mind, to have political freedom, you need economic freedom, and to have economic freedom, you really need political freedom. I don't know how you would put that.
I can only agree. You've read my mind, I think.
I was extremely impressed by going to an industrial and a scientific park. I have seen nothing like this before, these two parks, in either Canada or the United States. And these are vast industrial areas in which new products, new ideas are turned into prototype products and then ready for the consumer and mass marketing and production. And I have simply never seen anything like it in Canada or the US. They incubate ideas and turn these ideas into consumer products or high-tech products or industrial products. And I just find this is so impressive. How do you feel about that?
It touches the point we have already mentioned, and I can only fully agree. Yes, it is indeed quite impressive. Yeah.
As I mentioned, I've seen nothing like it in Canada or the USA. I doubt in Britain, my original home country, I've seen anything like it, or they have anything like it. How about Belgium, your home country?
We have some. We have got a research institute as well, but what is most extraordinary is how fast you can go from the research stadium to the production stadium, and this is something which seems to be quite unique for Taiwan, and which is of course a big advantage.
Yes, indeed. And I'm not sure that countries in Europe understand exactly what is going on in Taiwan. Would you agree?
Yes, I'm afraid so. I'm afraid we are, as we have already mentioned, being overtaken by the area, which does not need to be threatening, but it should ring some alarm bells back in Europe.
That's a good point about alarm bells, because in Canada, which has a very high standard of living, mainly because of natural resources, and a very small population of 30 million people, and a large area, it's got a very high standard of living, but it is not really moving ahead at all very dramatically, economically or technologically. We tend to buy foreign products all the time, and we don't make any products ourselves anymore. We just buy them from other countries. And to me, in the long term, this is going to create massive unemployment in Canada unless we start making our own products, high tech.
Indeed, I think we will become kind of only a consumer market without any innovation, and this is really threatening. And I think it will lead to a brain drain from Europe, and also maybe from Canada and the United States towards this region. I think this is obvious. If people get the opportunity to do their research in very, very good circumstances, then it's obvious that there will be a brain drain from the west to the east, let's say.
You mentioned about in Europe, it's an aging population, but a rich population, yes. So they can still spend money and buy consumer goods. What happens when that aging population dies off and they don't have any money to spend, or their children have got the money but have also spent their money? What happens?
That is indeed a very good question, which I cannot answer. But if you combine this with the brain drain I mentioned, then it does not look very good in the long run, I'm afraid.
An interesting point that in Canada, many of the entrepreneurs are actually Chinese from Hong Kong, and Air Canada, Canada's major airline, is basically going bankrupt, and the only people who are trying to save it is a big company in Hong Kong, Chinese company that wants to buy it. So aside from Taiwan, the Chinese in Taiwan building a new society, a new economy, they're even building these new economies and societies outside of Taiwan or Hong Kong. You know, they are the entrepreneurs in North America now, Chinese people. And I'm not against that, I'm just saying it seems to me that it's Hong Kong money or Taiwanese money, but it's also building new enterprises in North America, maybe in Europe too.
Well, I wouldn't only mention the economic side. It is possible. I'm not so aware of it, but I think you have to see it in a global picture. Globalization means more than economic relations. We are at a crossroads in history. The ideological strides are over. Environmental issues are becoming much more important, which Taiwan has understood very clearly. They present themselves as a green silicon island. So the problems we have mentioned about Europe and the enormous rise of this region will be part of the new, I wouldn't like to use the world order, but that's what it's That's what it implies. We are going towards a new kind of world, and I don't know where we will end up, but I am sure that ecology will be a very important part of this new world, and it's maybe the only way to survive in the long run.
Well, I've got a saying that when history moves, it moves quickly, and look how quickly the Soviet Union collapsed. Almost
Indeed,
overnight,
yes.
the Soviet Union collapsed overnight. So I wonder if people in Europe, or the USA or Canada, realize just what's happening in Asia, how quickly the future is moving to Asia. The future.
I don't think we realize it. You really have to come back to the. You really have to come to the region to realize it. Maybe you can read it in magazines or see it on television, but you really have to come to the region itself to grasp the way things are changing here and what kind of a challenge it is to the rest of the world.
And what's very strange is most people today drive cars that are made in Japan or made in Korea, and they use computers that are made in Japan, Korea or Taiwan, and electrical goods. So they're using goods produced in Asia all the time, each day, constantly, but they don't seem to realize the implications that the consumer products they buy are not made in their own countries, they're made in Asia.
Yes.
And it's looking them in the face to me. The future's looking them in the face, and they should wake up and say, listen, we better get moving.
I can only agree, yes.
Okay.
We are
Yes.
we are going somewhere where we don't want to go.
But
Yes,
But
you are right, but on
you buy
the camera we are...
every
yes.
single product you buy, high-tech product, it's made in Asia, increasingly more so. So the future is looking you in the face. I just saw in today's paper that Sony is about to buy MGM for $5 billion. You know, because they're moving, and this isn't bad in my opinion. If Sony wants to buy MGM for $5 billion, let them go ahead and do it. But why do not Americans realize that they are being taken over slowly by big industrial empires in Asia? What are Americans producing themselves anymore? Or what are Europeans producing themselves anymore? They are consumers, but they are not producers.
That's correct, yes. So shall we go to...
So anyway.
because we are really becoming
yes.
Stadler and Waldorf now.
Yes, but at least we're praising Asia.
No,
Yeah,
this
so
is,
you got his point.
no, this is very interesting, but maybe not for this particular
Yes.
documentary.
Okay.
Yeah, all right.
Maybe I'll
Shall we
find
talk
a,
about politics?
Yeah, maybe I'll find a way to get it in, but
Okay.
okay. So, what's your view on the? Let's start with the political situation domestically first, rather than
Hmm.
In
opening
Taiwan.
up China,
Yes.
like China can of worms. So, I guess what your observations and conclusions that you've arrived to with this particular visit?
When I came to Taiwan in 2000, and that was the first election in which the opposition actually won, because the old government had been in power for decades, basically since 1948, and so it was a massive shock to the old government that this new government, now under Premier Chen, had actually won the election, and it shook the foundations, political foundations here. But that's democracy, and although the old government and the old politicians could not understand that they had lost power, they paid lip service to democracy and be possible alternatives and competition in politics. But when it happened and they got thrown out, they didn't like it, and they became very bitter. And in this election, 2004, they hoped to beat Premier Chen again, did all they could to beat him, and when they didn't, they cried fraud and said it must be false, he must have cheated. But that's democracy, so I think in some sense they do not realize the implications in a democracy that you can lose as well as win. Whereas in Europe, Canada, the USA, elections have been going on for hundreds of years in which governments lose again, get re-elected, lose again.
Yes.
They haven't quite realized that in Taiwan to some extent.
So this is my first visit to Taiwan. I was invited by the Government Information Office in Brussels, and the main officer over there, he will return back to Taiwan in a few months, and just for fun I asked him, what was the most striking point of your stay in Belgium? So I expected the traditional answers. We enjoyed the good life, the good beer, the good chocolates. That's the answer you normally get. But he just said, I do appreciate the way the Belgians can find a compromise. And it was quite a remarkable answer, because we ourselves do not realize that we are so got used to compromising in Belgium. So Belgium is on the frontier of the northern part and the southern part of Europe, with their own, let's say, cultures. Brussels is right on the border, Brussels being the capital of Belgium and of Europe. So compromising is probably the way to go ahead also in the relations between the different political parties, let's say, here in Taiwan, and maybe also between Taiwan and mainland China. But in order to come to a compromise which allows you, or which allows both parties to save face, there must also be the political will to compromise. And that's maybe not every time very obvious, because the political system can maybe an obstacle to compromise. If one of both parties considers the other system to be a threat, then this could be a real obstacle to a compromise. To be more precise, the communist system and the democratic system do not completely match, and the one party can consider the other one to be a threat, which is, to my opinion, in this particular case, indeed so. But apart from the political will to compromise, there must also be the cultural possibility, or the cultural background to do so. And in order to compromise, or to find or to move to the middle ground, there must be a possibility, I think, in a certain way to forgive each other. And forgiveness is, to my opinion, a central point in Christianity. So Christianity is the cultural basis of the Western countries in Europe.
what impressed me about Premier Chen in his inaugural speech was when he said the 23 million people of Taiwan have a right, each man, each woman, to decide their future. That is, that nothing can be imposed on them. And Communist China, a dictatorship, wants to impose a dictatorship on Taiwan. Now, after the people on Taiwan have lived in freedom since 1948, why would they ever give up their freedom to be dictated to by an authoritarian regime? It doesn't make sense. In North America or in Europe, there's no single rational person would ever say, I'm going to give up my freedom to a police state, and I don't want to decide my future anymore. I'll just accept whatever government you want to give me, and that government can remain in power forevermore. So this is what Communist China may not understand, that these 23 million people have lived in freedom for decades, and now they're expected to suddenly give it up because Beijing wants to take it over. It can't happen. And I fully believe the alternative may happen if Taiwan can remain independent, and it is independent, for 10 or 15 years. Younger people moving up the scale on the mainland will have more flexible ideas, and they realize that the two systems are incompatible, and in fact Communist China will become more and more democratic and more reformist, and so eventually the two systems may merge voluntarily. But I simply do not see this island of 23 million people giving up their freedom to live under dictatorship. It's just unbelievable. And Beijing, of course, they do not really understand philosophically what this is all about, because they can't, because they've built their system on a dictatorship where the government tells you what to do, but power comes from the top down, not the ground up. And in Taiwan, of course, as in Europe, Canada, the United States, power comes from the ground up. We give people the authority at the top, only as long as they do not abuse that authority. Whereas in Beijing, power comes from the top down. They tell people what to do, and the people at the bottom have no choice but to accept that. And I cannot see Taiwan ever surrendering in any voluntary fashion. Why would they? But what I can see is, year after year, as the old generation, hardline generation in Beijing, fades away, younger people come to the top, we can avert chaos and catastrophe in this way, that the two nations will again merge on a voluntary basis slowly, if they want to. They may not want to, and why should they? But I saw Premier Chen's speech as being extremely moderate in tone, with a lot of foresight in itself, and gave me great optimism, because he is not the fanatic. Beijing likes to paint him as a fanatic and reckless. I do not believe he's a fanatic or reckless at all. He's a moderate man who believes in his own people. I'm not sure the Communist Party leadership in Beijing actually believes in their own people, just as the Soviet leadership in the Kremlin, the communist leadership, did not trust their own people to do what they wanted to do. And so all of a sudden they were very much shaken when they found their own people wouldn't stand for being abused anymore. And the revolution in Russia, the second revolution in Russia, came as quickly as the first revolution did. And the old regime was toppled just like that. And I can see this happening in Beijing too. The current regime will suddenly overnight die off or be toppled. And Tiananmen Square in 1991 should have been a lesson to the Communist Party and the hierarchy, that younger people will not stand forevermore to be dictated to, and that the Communist Party had, as it had in the Soviet Union, it had lost touch with the people, and particularly the young people. And this happened in Moscow, and it's happened in Beijing, and the fact that the students in Tiananmen Square were slaughtered, and those that weren't slaughtered were jailed, isn't going to stop it happening again. So they are going to have to relax and reform gradually, like it or not. And the beacon of light could be Taiwan, which is a very industrious nation, entrepreneurial nation, and younger people in China, by satellite TV, by the internet, cannot be kept ignorant of opposite viewpoints forevermore. They must know what's happening in Taiwan, and our people can speak freely and have all these democratic privileges, which they themselves would want eventually. They may want them now, but eventually they will get them. So I'm extremely optimistic that the communist regime in Beijing will eventually fall, as it did in the Soviet Union, and the people will be free to choose their own way of life. I initially came to Taiwan in 2000, and that was the election which Premier Chen of the opposition gained power for the first time. And the old government and the old party, the KMT, were absolutely shaken by this, because although grudgingly over the decades they'd agreed to reform the system and make it more democratic, and partly because of the United States influence, they never really expected to lose power. And when they did, they were totally shaken, because philosophically they did not understand that in a democracy, in a democratic system, you lose as well as win. And there's an analogy to this, because I've got a home in Mexico, and the former government in Mexico had been in power for 71 years. 71 years. And then actually in the same year that Premier Chen came to power in Taiwan, Vicente Vocht came to power in Mexico, and the old government in Mexico, after 71 years, just couldn't believe that it could lose an election. And that happened here. The KMT couldn't believe they could lose an election. They believed in democracy, and they set the stage for democracy and for fairness and competition, but they never thought it would happen. And when it did, they were really, really shaken. In this current election, and they just thought it was an aberration that they lost. So in 2004, again they thought Premier Chen would lose, and they'd be back in power as usual, and the game would just go on as usual. But that didn't happen. Premier Chen won again. And because they were so stunned once again by this move, instead of saying, well, the people have spoken, the voters have cast their ballots, they said something's gone wrong again, and Premier Chen must have committed fraud in this election. And even though there was an assassination attempt on Premier Chen the day before the election, and he was shot in the stomach, the KMT, or some people in the KMT, not all of them, said, oh, this assassination attempt must have been staged to get sympathy for Premier Chen. Well, that is absolutely ridiculous, because in any staged assassination attempt, something could go wrong, and the shot could have killed him. And the fact that he was shot in the stomach, if the shot had been 2 inches in either direction, he might have died. But the KMT hasn't come to the realization quite yet, as I say, that you win elections, you lose elections in a democracy. I believe that right now the KMT is looking deeply at itself, and has now come to the realization that we have lost 2 elections, and secretly they may believe we have lost them fairly, so we have to adapt to changing times and changing philosophies, and offer the Taiwanese people new policies. And that is the only way to beat Premier Chen, is to offer a firm alternative that appeals to the people. And if that alternative doesn't appeal to the people, they will lose the election again in 4 years' time. And alternately, Premier Chen, if he doesn't do what he says he's going to do, or if economic or political events turn against him, he will lose the election. And to my mind, the KMT, it believed in much closer relationships with mainland China, not complete capitulation to mainland China, to communist China, but I think they tended to believe that time is running out for Taiwan, so let's get the best deal we can and negotiate integration with mainland China right now. Whereas Premier Chen, his policy is not really no integration ever. His policy is, we don't want to give up our freedom, and only when the people in Beijing stop threatening us and bullying us and building up missiles against us will we talk to them on a firm basis. Right now he believes that all Beijing wants to do is keep threatening and saying, if you don't talk to us, if you don't integrate with us, we have 500 missiles, we'll launch our missiles at you, and then you'll be really sorry you did not talk to us, because we'll take you by force. In the long term, I've mentioned this before, I fully believe that as a younger generation grows up on the mainland, reforms will happen on the mainland, and eventually the two Chinas, and there are two Chinas, will come together again, because even Premier Chen said they come from a common culture, they have a common history, a common language, or common languages. What they do not have, basically, is a common political and economic philosophy. But that's changing. It's certainly changing on the mainland. Economically, China is reforming itself economically, and I believe it will reform itself politically too. Through, once again, the younger generation. That's what will happen. The old generation will die off, and a younger generation will come and take its place and look with more open eyes at Taiwan and the rest of the planet. And I believe that 250,000 students from mainland China studying at universities in Europe, in Canada and the US, and these 250,000 students are going to return to mainland China with a lot of new ideas about democracy. And while I say this, I will fully admit to you that Europe, Canada, the USA, they are not utterly perfect societies. They have their bad points too, but generally speaking, they do have freedom of opinion and very flexible societies. And when you've got 250,000 students from mainland China studying in Europe, Canada, and the US, and these students are going to go back, and obviously higher education are going to get the top positions in that society, their ideas are going to change that society. So I'm quite optimistic in the long term that there'll be no war between Taiwan and mainland China, and that the Taiwanese people, though there be only 23 million people compared to more than 1 billion people, will survive independently until they themselves decide they want to be part of the mainland, or the mainland Chinese people decide they want to adopt the system on Taiwan. So in bleak times or in worrying times, we often expect the worst things to happen. We have bad dreams and nightmares. We never expect that things may turn out to be okay, may turn out to be well. And I believe that I'm an optimist. I think that things will turn out well, and that the people on the mainland and the people in Taiwan will eventually live in peace and security and mutual happiness. So I'm an optimist.
Thank you.
So I'd like to come back to the big division which is seems to be growing in Taiwanese society after the election. The president mentioned it, I think, in his inaugural speech. So this division within society should not develop in what you could call a trench war, because when you are in a trench war and you camp on your own, or you stick to your own points of view, there is absolutely no way to move to kind of a middle ground and to find a compromise. And I think that's what is absolutely necessary in the coming, I would hope, months or weeks, to find this middle ground. And only if you are able to move to the middle ground, you will be able to compromise. And I think that's my personal opinion. To be able to move to the middle ground, you also need empathy, which I would define as the ability to get into the mind of the other party, of the opposing party. And when you listen carefully to the inaugural speech of President Chen, it was included, and I've got the speech over here, and I'd like to quote. He said, "If we make a concerted effort to find some positive aspect of our differences and commonalities," all right. So, however, if we make a concerted effort to find some positive aspect of our differences and commonalities, so then the building of a beneficial relationship would be possible. So the ability or the readiness for empathy and to move to the middle ground and to find a compromise was included, I think, in his speech, which was very conciliatory, not only towards the opposition, KMT and the People's First Party, but I think his speech was also very conciliatory towards mainland China.